Okay, in this section, we're going to be looking at what are some of the main problems that are caused by rapid human population growth. And we're also going to do a comparison of how population problems are different and alike in developed countries and in less developed countries. Before we start, I want us to look at a couple of facts. A lot of times students think that rapidly growing population is only occurring in developing countries because we just look at the percentages, and the percentage of population growth in developing countries is much higher. So, for example, in the population in the United States is only growing by approximately 1.5% per year, while Kenya's population is growing by 3.1% per year. So it seems like Kenya should be having a much larger population. But here's what I want you to notice. 150 million people. That was the United States population in 1950. 270 million was the U.S. population in 1998. That was a 68% increase in just 43 years, just in the United States. So in other words, a 1.5% increase is still a lot of people if you start with a lot of people. You can't just look at the percentages. 430 million people is the predicted population of the United States by 2050 if we continue growing at the current rate. So even if you're growing at a smaller rate, a smaller percentage than another country, if you start with a lot of people, then you'll still have a lot more than they do at the end, even though you were growing by a smaller amount. But let's put this in terms that relate to the environment. Right now, the United States is one of the fastest growing countries in the industrialized world. So what that means is that a baby born in the United States will damage the planet 20 to 100 times more than a baby born to a poor family in a developing country. So even though we may be growing at a smaller percentage, the people living in an industrialized country tend to cause a lot more damage to the environment than more people living in a less industrialized country. Right now, the population of the United States represents only about 5% of the world's population. But the U.S. produces about 20% of the world's goods and services. So that sounds great. Yeah, we're only 5% of the population, but we're producing 20% of the world's goods and services. However, we use about 33% of the world's processed minerals. Now think about that. 5% of the people are using 33% of the processed minerals. We also use about 25% of the world's non-renewable energy. That's energy produced from substances that aren't going to be replaced anytime soon. So once they're gone, they're gone. We also, as 5%, produce 33% of the world's pollution and garbage. So that kind of puts a different spin on it. There are different problems depending on what type of country you come from, but it doesn't make them less important. So Roman numeral 3, changing population trends. A, populations with high rates of growth create environmental problems. They use resources at a high rate and overwhelm the infrastructure. So in other words, high rates of growth are going to cause problems, but it causes more problems if you start with more people to begin with. B, infrastructure is the basic facilities and services that support a community. So it's all the things we're used to having here in the United States. For example, public water supply and treatment. The fact that we have clean water to use is something that we all take for granted, but everybody doesn't have that. Number 2, sewer lines. The fact that our wastes can be taken away and that we're not having to do something about it is very helpful. It also helps to reduce disease. Number 3, roads. I don't think people in the United States who've always had roads as long as they can remember can really appreciate what it means to live in a place where that's not available. Number 4, utilities. The fact that we have power, water, garbage collection, sewer, internet, phone lines, all of those things are what we mean by utilities. Number 5, schools. I know in this country everybody talks about, oh, they don't want to go to school, why do we have to do this, just get me out of here. But having schools available to everybody is not what's going on in some countries. In a lot of countries, the only people who can go to school are the ones who can pay for it. Number 6, hospitals. This isn't something that's available everywhere either. So these are all the things we're talking about that make up the infrastructure of a community. And if you have too many people, if you have population growth that's too fast, the infrastructure may not keep up with it. See, when population overwhelms infrastructure, symptoms can include overcrowded schools, pollution in the water, air, and land, inadequate housing, and underproductive land. So when you begin seeing those things, schools that are too crowded, water that isn't as clean as it should be, air and land that are polluted, not enough places for people to live, those are all symptoms of population overwhelming the infrastructure. D, several problems or consequences that develop with overpopulation are, and some of these are going to be surprising because it's not something we have to deal with. Number 1, shortage of fuel wood. That's surprising to us because we don't use wood as our primary source of fuel. Number 2, contaminated water. Number 3, shortage of fertile farmland. Number 4, social unrest. And we're going to talk about each of these individually in a minute. Number 5, environmental refugees. Now some of these may be things you haven't heard of the term before, but most of them, as we talk about them, you're going to realize what they mean. E, in many developing countries, wood is the fuel used for cooking, for providing heat, and to heat water for purification so that you can get diseases out of the water. Wood for fuel is the limiting resource because it begins to run out when the trees are cut down faster than the trees can grow to replace them. So in other words, when you have a growing population, they need more and more trees to use for fuel, and eventually you reach the point that the trees can't grow fast enough to replace the ones being cut down. That means they become a limiting factor. When there are no trees left, the population will begin to decline. So in other words, once you run out of trees and you don't have anything else to use for fuel, for cooking, for providing heat, and to use for purifying water, then people are going to start to die from weather conditions because they don't have enough cooked food to eat, and because of diseases from the water that's contaminated. F, in poor countries, there may be no infrastructure in place to purify the water. The same water source is used for drinking water, cleaning, and waste disposal. This causes the water to contain disease-carrying organisms. When cities grow very rapidly, the available water supply may not be able to keep up and will lead to contaminated water. Now, to us, the idea of drinking muddy water out of a puddle like this picture is almost more than any of us can think of. Because that's just not something we have to deal with. But the human body has to have water. You can go for several weeks without food. You can go for several days without water, and you can only go for a couple of minutes without air. Well, if the only water you have available is something like in this picture, after several days of not having any water, you'll drink it simply because you have to have it. And if there's disease in it, then you just have to deal with it. G, when a city increases in population, the additional people have to have somewhere to live. This means increasing the amount of housing, which is built on land that may have been used for farming. So you can see the problem that can develop. You have to have land for farming to produce food for everybody, but then you've also got to have it to use for housing. This reduces the ability of the land to produce food for a growing population. So you have this catch-22 where you got to have housing, but you got to have land you can use for agriculture too. So there's this conflict over how do you use the land. Number 1, land that can be used for growing crops is referred to as arable. Not all land is arable. An example, if you've got land that is going up the side of a mountain, it may not be suitable for growing crops. Number 2, as cities grow, there are competing uses for land, including agriculture, housing, and habitat for animals. All of those things are needed for the land, so you get this conflict in trying to figure out how do we use the land and have enough to meet the needs of all the people. If you look at this map, this shows the percentage of land in each country available to use for crops. And notice, the United States is not even in the top part of it. And part of that is because the land that we have available, part of it is being used as mountains, part of it is desert, and all of that keeps us from being able to use it for agriculture. Number 3, as land becomes less productive, in other words, if we keep using it over and over and over and we don't find a way to make it more fertile, it'll eventually wear out. So as land becomes less productive, people that may have worked in agriculture begin to move to cities to find jobs. So now the land isn't productive enough to give us the food we need. That means people that were doing that may not be able to have a job there. They move to cities, and then this increases the population in those cities. And that leads to overwhelming the infrastructure. Number 4, much of the world's population is experiencing urbanization, which means that more people are living in cities than in rural areas. This also increases suburban sprawl, which is when people have jobs in cities but live in the area around the cities. So if you work in somewhere large like Atlanta, then you drive out of town, out into the more suburban areas, and that's where you actually live. So Atlanta is an example, and this picture shows you what we're talking about. If you look at this picture, way over here, you can see the skyscrapers, the tall buildings. That's the city. Now this is actually not Atlanta. I think this is Los Angeles. But look at all of the people on all of the land out here, the suburban areas. Now, what I want to show you is a simulation of what happened in Phoenix, Arizona. As you watch this, you'll see what's going on. This is from a satellite image that shows, they're going to zoom in on Phoenix, that's going to show what has happened to this area over time. So it says each year in the U.S., urban sprawl replaces over 2 million acres of agricultural and forested land. Now what the red parts you're seeing are roads, And as it gets in closer, the colors will change some. All right, in 1912, this picture shows Phoenix. Development in the arid west began with agriculture fed by water from canals and dammed rivers. So you have these rivers, and then they produce canals off of them, and all the green area is the agricultural area. Pink is the urban area. So look at the clock up here. After World War II, larger water diversion projects along with the invention of air conditioning led to explosive growth. Now look what's happening. The green is disappearing. That was the agricultural areas. All of the suburban sprawl is taking over that. By 1979, there's almost no agricultural area left. It's now up to 1984, and you can still see these are actual satellite images. As you can see, the urban area is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Alright, it's now in 2004. There's almost no urban area left. One of the problems is that this is in an area that's very dry and possibly desert at one time. So they're having problems with what are they going to do about water as it continues to get bigger. This is Lake Mead, and water levels have been dropping. In 2004, from 2000 to 2004, all the orange areas are places that are now exposed land where it used to be underwater because they're using up the water. So that's going to be one of the big issues in the future for this area, is how do you come up with enough water to feed all of those people? Not just in Phoenix, but it says most of the world's population lives in urban areas. So not planning is going to cause natural resources to get used up at a much faster rate. H, as population increases, the available resources must be divided into smaller amounts. When people have to compete for dwindling resources, conflict begins to occur. An example is when we looked at the video where we looked at how the states got their shapes. Remember, water rights between two countries or states were causing conflict. It looked mostly at the Tennessee River, which was up here, but there's another problem. Down here, this border, if you look at this map, this border between Alabama and Georgia is the Chattahoochee River. It drains down into Florida in the Panhandle and finally out to the Gulf of Mexico. The problem is Georgia wants to pull water out of that to try to supply water to Atlanta. But look what that means. It means that people in this part of Alabama will lose water, and the people down here in the Panhandle of Florida will have the most to lose because that whole river will then get almost dry. So that's the kind of conflict we're talking about. I, when people are driven from their homes by environmental problems or damage, they may be referred to as environmental refugees. These people have to move somewhere else, and that helps to increase the population in their new location. Now, this is showing somewhere else besides the United States, but this has actually occurred in the United States to an extent. When Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast, all the people who lived there had to go somewhere else, and it was for an extended period of time. It took a long time to replace all the infrastructure that was destroyed. So as they moved, it was due to environmental damage caused by the hurricane. As they moved, they caused an increase in population in other places. So examples of this could be A, fleeing areas experience decades of famine. Famine means that it is that there's no production of food going on because of environmental and climate conditions, and it's something that goes on for a long period of time. B, migrating away from worn-out farmland. Some people in some areas don't have access to fertilizers and things like that. Or it may be that the fertilizers are so expensive they can't afford to buy it. That's not usually in this country, but in other countries. So as a result, they keep farming the same piece of land over, and after generations, that land just has no nutrients left in it. C. Victims of tsunamis in coastal regions where the land is poisoned by salt. Now, this actually happened after Hurricane Katrina down along the Gulf Coast. The storm surge that comes in from the hurricane is salt water, and it may come in inland several miles. Well, when it does, the salt, as the water recedes, some of that water soaks down into the soil, and it has salt in it, and it poisons the soil for a extended time after that. That salt in the soil causes it to be unproductive. They can't use it anymore. So people who need that land for farming can't use it anymore. And that's all for today.